going into age 14-ish, things sound like they started to get a bit serious. Tell us what went on during that time.
Yeah, only 14-year-old playing for the local boys club would get absolutely battered. Only a village team. We play against the local towns. It was regular for me. I'd concede 4, 5, 6, and against some of the better ones, it could be double figures. Never lost the motivation to keep playing. But never been attached to a football club. Parents had never had a phone call or a knock on the door from any club. And then I actually wrote to Bristol Rovers, who were advertising in the local evening paper for trialists. And I was 14 and a half, and I wrote to the PO Box number in Bristol and was invited down to the boys' village down in St. Athens, down near Barry, with probably, I would say, another 150 lads. And there was just a series of 11v11 games. And a week later, a letter arrived just saying, would I be able to go across for the next school holidays over to Bristol? And which I did, a couple of days. I joined in training with the schoolboy players over there. And then occasionally they'd invite me over to play on a Sunday. And that was the only football experience I had. And then at 16, they offered me an apprenticeship. But still no real formal coaching. So probably learned the game by mistakes, and just sort of came through that way, really.
So what would a typical training session or visit to Bristol to Rovers look like?
It would be a couple of laps around the pitch, probably definitely a game in some format, depending on the amount of people there, and then maybe a little bit of finishing, but only one coach to run the whole session, so no individual work whatsoever, and basically, deal with everything yourself. There was no, not like today where, you have all the different support staff. But the actual coach was an ex-player, Colin Dobson. I think he played for England under 23, Sheffield Wednesday. Colin was fantastic. Just the way he dealt with people and the way he managed the whole environment. And when I first joined at 16, I went to live in Bristol. Colin had just finished playing then, and he basically looked after us. And I went on and played in his youth team, and in a short space of time was in the first team.
Yeah, wow. So thinking back to that kind of training environment, Tomo, you described it really well. What kind of stuff do you think that gave you, like the positives? And then what kind of stuff do you think you potentially missed out on there?
Do you mean once at 15, once I was sort of going over to Bristol?
Yeah, them training sessions that were like a lap round the pitch in a game.
Yeah, like for me, it was my first experience of that environment of a professional club. So I was obviously on a high. It was the opportunity really to once I got over to Bristol, sort of socially meeting other players. But I think the training environment itself was just so competitive, even at that sort of young age, because Rovers had a history of producing young players for their first team, but they had a philosophy was totally different to probably the 91 other clubs. And their philosophy was they only used to offer apprenticeships to 2 as a minimum and 4 as a maximum, whereas other clubs would do 8 or 10. But they wanted or believed that it would be better that if it was only 2 or 3, that they could then expose them to the first team environment earlier. So when I first went over there, the training was literally a couple of laps. You'd have a game and you'd have a shooting session, but you would have an opportunity. Sometimes I'd go up and train with like Tony Pulis and people like that who were 2 and 3 years older than me, you know. So I think because they were a relatively small club, although at the time in Division 2 or the Championship now, it was definitely an environment where you knew you would get an opportunity if you were good enough.
Yeah, and then what are some of the things that environment didn't give you? Knowing what you know now.
Yeah, what it probably didn't give me. I think probably the education. Definitely the education in terms of maybe the social side of it, in terms of looking after yourself. And at 16, it was still very much a culture of play hard, but at the same time, the environment I was brought up in South Wales, it was, the social side of it with sort of rugby lads. And maybe it would be better if I'd had a sort of education of how to look after myself, what to eat, what not to eat, how to live really. But for me, I was just on I was just on such a high because it was an opportunity which, at 14 and a half, I hadn't anticipated a life in football. It was going to be a life in the police force, I was already going the police cadets. That was, that was my ambition, not football.
Yeah. And I guess one of the challenges for coaches in the current day is, with all the resource, knowledge, expertise that we've got, how do we kind of like distribute that evenly so there's enough challenge and motivation for the young players, but there's also enough specialism and enough detail going in as well. So I guess how would you kind of like transfer that into today's environment?
Yeah, because at that particular time, Tim, there was no real specialism. You did only have one coach, and you didn't get a lot of sort of individual work. But the challenge was that you were thrown into an environment which was a sink or swim. You knew at the end of it that, there might only be two apprenticeships or 4 apprenticeships on offer. And at the same time, there was a lot of other lads wanting the same as you. And the challenge really of, playing with older players and more experienced players. I think that was the real benefit, is that early exposure to youth team football and, 16-year-old playing in the football combination. I don't think you can give that the young players that today. But probably what I missed out on is all the other support they get today, especially when I look at sort of the performance analysis and all the data that's available now. But it wasn't then, so we basically just got on with it. And I'm sure I lived the life of what most 16-year-old goalkeepers, throughout the Football League would have lived, Yeah.
And what attributes do you think you had which helped you the most? What made you be successful in that setting?
I think physically I wasn't mature, but I think I had a maturity in terms of playing the game and how I thought about the game. And it's a really interesting question because I'm not the typical pathway. So I think that's why I'm so interested in talent ID, is that how can you go from 14 and a half, never been coached, to making your debut at 16, and I was playing regular in Division 2 when I was 17.
Yeah.
And I rattled up 100 games before I was 20-year-old. At 19 was my 100th game. So, how did I must have had a strategy to be able to cope. I probably had a good mentality for it, could take the pressure, and definitely wasn't fazed by it. Playing at Upton Park and Stamford Bridge and those places, Roker Park, St James's Park at 17-year-old. When I look back, I didn't have a nerve in my body, So, but I must have had some talent,
So thinking about our young players today, Tomo, boys and girls, we're kind of asking them and looking for them to go out and find loan opportunities in men's football or women's football, aged 17 upwards. What advice would you be giving in their first loan in adult football?
I think firstly they need to be ready for the loan. So the psychology of the loan, I think, is really important. There'll be some goalkeepers at 17-year-old. Physically, they might look as if they're ready, but maybe psychologically they aren't ready for that sort of environment. I think the history says that the goalkeepers who have been on loan, there's been a massive benefit. So when you look at all the England goalkeepers, the current goalkeepers, and probably the ones before them, all of them have experienced, either exposure to first team football at a real young age, or have gone out on loan and various loans and progressive loans. And as long as they've had a successful loan, then the clubs have looked to let them go again onto what would be considered a higher loan, And I think it's there's a massive benefit in that, not only from a football point of view, but a social point of view, that they get to see something that's a little bit different. I look now at obviously the facilities and everything that are available for clubs. And, sometimes they are in an environment that is a little bit wrapped up in cotton wool, whereas once they actually get out on loan, the reality sets in of that football is a competitive game and it's a competitive industry, and you need to be ready for it.
Yeah, nice. So when did talk us through the success you had at Bristol, and then the subsequent moves from there, and bigger moves as you climbed up and started to perform at bigger clubs.
Yeah, I joined in the summer of 76, and at the time there was a goalkeeper who was a year older than me, a lad called Glyn Jones, and then there was one senior goalkeeper. And the first season I was there, the club went away end of season. They went to America to play against Portland Timbers. The goalkeeper got injured while playing on AstroTurf. So when I rejoined for what would be, would have been set just 60, just nearly 17. I played a couple of games in the first team in testimonial matches. And when I rejoined, the goalkeeper didn't come back for pre-season training because he was having a back injury. And Don Megson, the manager, that's Gary's dad, called us both in. I'm, as I say, nearly 17, I think. Glyn was nearly 18. And he called us both in and he said, look, I don't know how long Jim is going to be out, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to play you pre-season and then make a decision as to whether we get another goalkeeper or whether we go with yourselves. And we shared pre-season, and then for the very first game, he just said to me, I'm going to stick you in the team. I'll see how it goes. And if I need to bring another goalkeeper in, I will. And unfortunately, Jim had to retire, and he threw me in, 17-year-old. And played 38, I think, games the first season. I played all the games the following season, and pretty much got up to the 100th game in, as I say, within just over 2 seasons.
Yeah, brilliant.
It wouldn't happen now because I think managers would be under too much pressure. I think there's no way they would throw a 17-year-old in. But Don left after a couple of months of that first season, and the new manager took over, who was a coach internal in the club. And I thought, well, maybe he'll now bring an experienced goalkeeper in, but he didn't. He stuck with me, and so that was the high. But then I had a real low. I had a bad hand injury at 19-year-old, which I needed 3 operations on, and I missed a year's football. And as you know, in this game, Tim, when you're out, somebody else gets an opportunity, and Phil Kite came along, did really well. So the club were in a good situation, really. You had 2 young goalkeepers, probably in a position where, if they needed to make some money. And basically that's what happened. I went on loan to Tottenham for 6 weeks and then signed for Newcastle.
In them 100 games or so, Tomo, what kind of stuff, what made you stand out as a good young goalkeeper, and what made other clubs, interested in taking you?
Ironic, when I look at things now, my dad kept, before he passed away, my dad kept a lot of scrapbooks and bits and pieces. So when I cleared the loft, as such as he used to call it, where he used to keep everything, my mother said, "Oh, there's all the scrapbooks over there." And when I brought them back, I was just looking through some of them, and the one thing they talked about of myself was that I played with a maturity far beyond my years. So whatever that was, Tim, it must have been a body language. It must have been a composure. I definitely was proactive in the way I played the game. Yeah. I think I was better at crosses at 18 than I was at 28. Because at 18-year-old, I played with no fear, whereas at 28, maybe at a different club, all of a sudden you realize the risk and reward. I think that was probably my strength. I could go to places, big stadiums, and not be fazed by it.
Yeah. So now you've moved to Newcastle. Tell us a bit about that, and tell us a bit about how training might have changed and evolved at this stage, and when you might have started doing some different stuff in training.
Well, it was quite ironic with signing for Newcastle, in that the first team coach was Willie McFall. Now, Willie had played about 600 games in goal for Newcastle. So when I'm signing there, one, Arthur Cox was the manager. Willie was there as his assistant. So I'm thinking, obviously that's great to have a coach as an ex-goalkeeper. The quality of the players, the Keegans, the Chrissy Waddles and the Beardsleys and McDermotts and people like that. So the environment itself was fantastic. But then going to a club like Newcastle from Bristol, I was used to playing in front of 5,000. And then all of a sudden to get at St. James's with a full house, it was unbelievable. How did things change on the training ground? Probably the competition in terms of when I was at Rovers, there was myself and Glyn Jones. But then when I went to Newcastle, sort of Kevin Carr was a local hero. He played a few seasons there, so I knew it was going to be difficult to break in. In terms of goalkeeping training, very, very little. Arthur Cox did a lot of small-sided games, total football. If you score 3, we'll score 4, that type of mentality.
Yeah.
And very little coaching as such. I think because the quality of the players that he had, you had sort of Kevin up front with, you signed Peter Beardsley and then Chris Waddle, and then Terry McDermott, sort of those surging runs from midfield. Yeah. So we didn't work defensively hardly at all. Fullbacks bombed on. So we did often get caught on transition because, but it wasn't sort of coaching day to day. It was a lot of sort of small-sided game type practice,
Yeah. And then how's going off on a slight tangent here, how's the technology or the equipment changed during this time? So from 16 to like kind of 24, 25, what was your equipment like? What were your boots like? What were your gloves like? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, literally at Rovers, we got given what they called a boot chitty, and we went to the sports shop and basically got whatever boots we wanted up to a certain level, depending on whether you're apprentice or pro, and you'd get 2 pairs a year. But I was really fortunate in when I signed for Newcastle, because Nike were actually based up in Gateshead, and they'd already signed Chris Waddle and a couple of the players. And the Everton centre forward, Jim Pearson, was head of football there. So Jim used to come up to St. James's a lot, and he used to basically sort all the lads out. So from going with a chitty, mate, there'd be a big box beginning of the season, big box for Allison as well. And and they were quite happy that as long as you'd wear their boots, they'd give you a load of leisure wear, So
nice.
It was a little bit different. But in terms of the on the training ground, nothing really changed, in terms of the football equipment or anything,
And what about your gloves? Tell us about the story of your gloves.
Yeah, I had when I was in Bristol, we had a lad come in on trial, a lad called Kevin Roberts, and he'd been at Swindon on trial, and the Swindon goalkeeper Jimmy Allen was also a lay preacher, and during the summer, out of season, he used to go to America and he used to preach, and when he was out there, he used to do some training at a local club, met a German who had these German goalkeeper's gloves on. So anyway, Kevin said, this is the company. So I wrote to the company in Germany. They got back to me. I used to purchase my gloves direct from them. And then when the license came to England, the Reusch license, they basically said to me, look, we'd like to supply you. So from probably 19-year-old until I was 36, I always wore Reusch gloves, because for all that time, they just kept me in stock, shall we say.
Yeah. And how did you see them develop from being a young player, like back at 16 when you first started the professional stuff, through to 30? What developments did you see? What differences?
Well, the major difference for me was that I've gone from sort of green cotton, what would be deemed gardening gloves, to the modern glove of a latex glove. But as I said, I'd had a bad hand injury at Rovers, so just the day-to-day protection as well that they offered. At 23, I did my scaphoid, which at that particular time was obviously the scaphoid's little bone in the wrist, which over the last 3 years I've had to have a wrist fusion because of it. So the new glove technology definitely helped. Just in terms of just really looking after my wrist and 2 of my fingers, which I'd had chronic dislocations with, So, yeah.
So you moved to Newcastle. Tell us a little bit about what place that had in your career, and then what came after that.
Yeah, it was the Newcastle experience was unbelievable, because I went from Arthur Cox, very offensive. As I talked about the players earlier on, absolutely world-class players. And then Gaza come on the scene, so everything was free and open football and exciting. And then Arthur left to take the Derby job, and Jack Charlton came in, and Jack had a totally different philosophy to football, a lot more structure. In terms of first time I've ever been coached, because at Rovers, as I said, it was a little bit free and easy. but first time I've ever had a coach actually set us up in phases of play. Okay. Say, right, this is exactly what I want. I'd have to say Jack, in terms of how to win games, and knowing exactly what your role and responsibility was absolutely top class. We didn't have as good a team. Didn't have as good a players in Jack's season as what we had with Arthur, because Kevin retired, Terry Mack retired, Wadler went to Tottenham, Peter went to Liverpool. But under Jack, we were so well organised, and really difficult to beat. And unfortunately, you know, the crowd at St. James's, they had been spoilt the previous season because, you know, Wadler, Kevin and Peter scored like 66, 67 goals, you know. So all of a sudden now you play 4-4-2, you know, you play with 2 target men, very strict in terms of what he wanted, but could win football matches and proved, you know, by doing the same with Republic of Ireland. So I think that was the biggest change in terms of football. And then the money that started coming the game meant that, you know, the transfer fees. And when Willie took over as manager, all of a sudden the board have said to him, there you go, there's 5 million quid. So he went and he bought five players. And unfortunately, the dynamics of the team, dynamics of the club, it probably lost their way a little bit. And got relegated within probably 18 months. Yeah. So
okay. It's interesting just listening to some of the experiences that you've been part of with style of play of the teams that you played in, and also style and characteristics of the coaches that you were around. What that started doing to me is I can see now where some of your beliefs and strategies, approaches, methodologies that you've maybe established yourself have come from the experiences you've had as a player.